Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this wonderful event tonight, compliments of the Geelong Regional Library Corporation. My name is Jennifer Costa, and I'm absolutely delighted and excited to welcome the fabulous Pip Williams, author of this remarkable book, The Dictionary of Lost Words. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the Wadawurrung and Eastern Maar original owners of the lands on which our library services operate. We pay respect to the Wadawurrung and Eastern Maar elders, past, present, and emerging, and we acknowledge and celebrate First Nations people of this land as the custodians of learning, literacy, knowledge, and story. Now, just remember, everyone, you can participate in tonight's event in the Q&A section down at the bottom of your screen. You might need to touch your screen to make that pop up. If you have a question you'd like me to ask Pip, please type it up and we'll see how many we can get to. I have lots myself, but we do want people to participate, so you're very welcome. Also, this webinar is being recorded, and so if you'd like to watch the conversation again, you'll be able to do so after tonight. And of course, you can recommend it to family and friends. I think it's going to be terrific because I know Pip's going to be amazing. So tiny bit of background about myself. I am also an author. My books are mostly about Georgette Heyer, the great British novelist, best-selling novelist. I also write fiction, and my book Jane Austen's Ghost came out last year. But Pip, of course, is our guest tonight, our celebrated guest, and her fabulous book. Pip is, this is her debut novel, although not her first book. Her first book was a memoir of her year in Italy, also published by Affirm Press. And we're very excited because the Dictionary of Lost Words has come out in America today, Pip. That's right.
Yesterday, yeah, it was published yesterday.
And also it's coming out in the UK. It's also being translated into about a dozen languages. So huge achievement and terrific. Looking forward to learning loads about the book tonight. So Pip, wonderful. Congratulations on this beautifully constructed, remarkable novel, which tells quite an amazing multi-layered story. But I'd like to begin by asking you, you're inspired to write the Dictionary of Lost Words, I believe, after reading Simon Winchester's book, The Surgeon of Crowthorne. Can you just tell us a little bit about that, please?
Absolutely. A friend of mine lent me The Surgeon of Crowthorne, thinking I'd be interested because I'm interested in words and writing. And I read it, and it was an absolutely fascinating tale. I highly recommend it. It's non-fiction, and it's about the relationship between the editor, James Murray, of the Oxford English Dictionary, and one of the volunteers. And when I say volunteers, I might use this word a few times during our talk. A volunteer for the OED was just someone from the general public who would answer James Murray's call to the public to find words and how they'd been used in text. So what he asked people to do, and I think of this as one of the first crowdsourced projects, actually, because he put advertisements in periodicals and journals around the world, asking people to send in sentences that used specific words sometimes, but any words in general, and then to tell him what book it was from and when it was published and so on. And they would use these sentences to then collate and define the words of the English language. And so one of the more notorious volunteers was a man by the name of William Chester Minor. He was a doctor, and he was a doctor during the American Civil War. And this is the relationship. The Surgeon of Crowthorne is the story of the relationship between these two men. Very interesting. And what I got from it in the end, though, was a bit of an understanding of how the dictionary was actually compiled. And while the story was fascinating, for about a year after reading it, all I could think about was that it was a gendered text, that the whole methodology, I suppose, of how the words were collated and defined and put into this dictionary was flawed, because a word had to have a textual history to be entered into the dictionary. And this was a Victorian era project when the majority of texts, novels, poetry, professional manuals were written by men. And so, and all of the lexicographers were men, all of the editors were men, all of the people paying for the project were men. While there were a few female assistants, they had no decision-making power. Is it sounding familiar? But most of all, the words were coming from books that were written by men on the whole. And I wondered, if this is the case, is it possible that we've lost something in our effort to define the English language? And is it possible that women's words might be missing to some extent, or the meanings that women would ascribe to words? Could they be missing from the Oxford English Dictionary?
Well, it's a fabulous starting point, I must say. And really, I think for many modern readers, these are really obvious questions. But what I found really fascinating was in the original call to contributors for what became the Oxford English Dictionary, it explains that the dictionary will include, and I'm quoting now, materials consisting of quotations illustrating the use of English words by all writers of all ages and in all senses. So that tends to suggest that they really wanted to be all-encompassing. But your novel makes it clear that the use of all, and there's a word, did not include women.
Yes. Yes. And actually, while we're on the definition of words and the definition of all, in a way, and this is another theme of the book, obviously, because of the time that all of this happened, it reminds me a bit, and I haven't thought about this before, Jen, but it does remind me also of that word universal. So the word universal was quite popular at this time because universal suffrage had been, I suppose, the political fight in the 100 years prior to this happening. Universal suffrage not being women's suffrage. Universal suffrage was defined as the right for all men, no matter what race, age. I mean, obviously there was an age, but race, profession, land ownership, and so on. Universal suffrage applied was the fight for all men to have the vote. And what I found so interesting in that definition was that we have a different understanding of what universal means. It does mean all, and yet women were excluded from that particular definition at that time as well. But yes, and it does say all writers, and that was the problem with the method. It's that, first of all, most of the published writers were men, but also we're talking about a time when literacy was much lower than it is today. So it's not just women's words that I think were missing in many instances. It's also working class words, and you could go further than that. Words that were developing through migrants and immigrants and so on as well would have been excluded from that first edition.
The poor and the illiterate. It was very much about a concept of who mattered, but very, I think, largely unconscious in that idea that, you know, these are the people that matter, and you don't need to take into account, you know, particularly the oral language, which is something we'll come to a bit later too, because of course it relates very much to Australia's own history. It's been said that the idea of using the quotations was that so that the dictionary, and this is a quote, could demonstrate the full range of characteristics of each and every word with a very great degree of precision. But your main character, Esme, by dint of her own efforts to compile a list of lost words, makes it very clear that this was not achieved. So throughout your book, there are moments where Esme finds a word or goes and looks up a word and then discovers that the meaning she's now come to understand is actually has not been included in. So can you explain two things, a little bit about the methodology, the physical methodology they use with the slips and then how it is that so many meanings were excluded?
Yeah, absolutely. So basically, and it hasn't changed, we do have now digital do have digital tools, but essentially the method is the same today as it was 100 years ago. So what happens is the lexicographers get an example of a word and they want to see how that word has been used in different contexts. And so James Murray sent out this call, and people would send in little slips of paper about the size of a postcard, and it would have the word at the top, then the sentence that the word was used in. So it could have been, you know, the fox jumped over the log, for instance, and they're interested in the word jump. So that is an example of how to use the word jump, and it gives the reader an idea of what the word means. And then they would have the attribution, so the author and the year and the name of the book. And all of that information actually goes into the dictionary if that slip of paper and that word and sentence are deemed good enough. And what the Oxford English Dictionary does, which is different to most dictionaries, is it also collates the history of that word. So that sentence I just used might have come from, 1884, but they might have another 10 slips that come before and after that sentence. And so the assistants and lexicographers would put them in chronological order. They would check the source, make sure that it was correct. And they would also, I suppose, pick and choose sentences that were the best examples of the various usages of a word, remembering that so many words in English have many, many meanings. So, for instance, I think the word lost takes up about 10 pages of the dictionary. There are so many different ways of using it. The word go was, a nightmare apparently to define. There are so many variants for different words. And then those slips, they're put in order, and then the lexicographer comes up with a definition that encompasses that particular word or that variant of the word, and then puts it on top of the slips, ties it in piece of string, and that bundle gets sent to Oxford University Press. That's how it happened 100 years ago. So, which is basically a journey of about 10 minutes on a bicycle, even less. But it would physically be transported, wrapped in string, and then given to the composer who would then typeset it. And so that's how it happened.
That's extraordinary. So I've had one little curiosity question. In the book, you talk about Dr. Murray and the word Africa.
Yeah. Oh.
Can you? What?
Don't talk to Dr. Murray about the word Africa. Okay. So this is interesting because at the beginning of this project, so this is a project that the idea was, I suppose, posed back in the 1850s, around 1858, I think. And then it didn't really take off because the gentlemen of the London Philological Society were gentlemen. They were upper class, well-educated, Oxford, Cambridge blokes. And while they had this wonderful idea, they didn't really have the grunt that it took to edit a dictionary of this magnitude. And what they were trying to do was improve on Samuel Johnson's dictionary, which had been around for a few hundred years, really. It had been updated here and there, but it was inadequate. It didn't have all of the words in the English language. And bless his heart, Samuel Johnson, if he couldn't find a definition, he would often just make it up. So it was quite an idiosyncratic undertaking, that particular one. And they just wanted a definitive text that would define not just current words, but also words that were already obsolete. So it was a huge undertaking. In the end, it took 70 years, but it didn't actually get started until James Murray came on. And he was just a school teacher from Scotland. He wasn't educated at university level at Oxford and Cambridge. So it took a long time to convince the gentleman that he was the man for the job. But once he got started, he really was the driving force behind it. And so the first volume was published in 1888, and that's the words beginning with A and B. And it's the beginning of this very long project. And so I suppose if you went back and you had a look at the volumes, the words and definitions, it gets tighter and tighter the more experience that they had, essentially. And right at the beginning, they decided not to have pronouns. So Africa was left out because it was the name of a country. But not long after they'd made that decision, they realized, actually, we can't leave all countries out, because so often we say African or American. So by the time they got to America, they'd changed their minds. And so America got in, but Africa was left out, which was an inconsistency. But they realized they had to change it at some stage. They were at A, they'd made a mistake. America gets in, Africa got left out. Africa gets in the supplement, but that takes another 40 years before Africa made it into the dictionary.
There's some kind of hideous irony about that, I have to say. And it actually leads me into another quote where the editor, James Murray, explained the difficulty of, quote, pushing our way through an untrodden forest where no white man's axe has been before us, which is kind of a bit icky today. But I guess it tells us a lot about the unconscious biases at work in compiling the dictionary. So for all of its magisterial importance, and it is an incredibly important and remarkable book, and one that I think, billions of people use and should use, isn't it the original OED innately sexist and racist?
Absolutely. And in fact, they're still debating many of the words and definitions in the dictionary. Not the words so much. The Oxford English Dictionary never takes a word out of the dictionary, but it has been updating it in the 3rd edition. It has been updating many of the definitions and explanations and sources for words. And it is finding that there is still so much sexist and racist and classist language in the text, but they are working to change that. But back when we're talking about the 1st edition, this is the edition that was published in full in 1928. And one of the wonderful things about doing the research for this, and I had access to 12 beautiful volumes at the State Library of South Australia. And one of the wonderful things is as you look, I would go to look for a particular word, but of course I'd get waylaid as I was turning the pages, because like I said, it's a history book in that it gives us the history of a word, but it's also a history book in that it's an artifact of a particular time and place. And so you were talking about the sexist and racist language and saying how it was an unconscious bias. You're absolutely right. And the language that they sometimes used around some words, they would use, natives. They would use words that today we would find abhorrent and unacceptable. But they also gave away a lot about themselves, not just their racism and so on, but also their morality and their values and their stuffiness. So one example is the word pants. They weren't fond of slang, so this is another telling characteristic of the dictionary. They didn't think that slang was proper English, mostly because they didn't use it. Whereas a lot of working class people, it was proper English for them because it was the words that they used to describe their lives, but those words weren't good enough for the dictionary. But some slang words did get in. One is pants, trousers. So we would use the word pants all the time now. That's in the original dictionary. And next to it, it's got pants, a vulgar abbreviation of pantaloons. And so they would make these they would qualify things using their own judgment constantly in the dictionary, which for us is fascinating because we think of these things, we think of dictionaries as objective texts. We go to them when we're squabbling around Scrabble words, whether a word should be included or not, thinking that it's the definitive text and it can't be argued with. And I think one of the things that I realized writing this book is how flawed they often are. And I'll never play Scrabble again I'll never take someone's dictionary definition as gospel.
Don't deny yourself that pleasure, Pip.
No.
So you write so beautifully about words, their power and their meaning, and about how they both liberate and constrain us. That's right through the novel. And one of the many things that I really loved about your book, and there were many, was the way you highlighted some of the real and, to me, obvious problems with this founding premise of the dictionary. And you do a great job of teasing this out, and through Esme and the encounter she has with words. One of these was the idea that if there was no written phrase, then it followed that there was no concept prior to that, which seems to me to be patently nonsensical. And you deal with this so effectively, having Esme question the absence of the illiterate, the working poor, the working class, anyone whose words have not been written down, apparently, and they're often really important and useful words that were in common parlance, but they were not written down, and so therefore they weren't deemed worthy to be put into the dictionary. So can you, I mean, the whole starting point of your novel, and then how you developed it into this flowering, magnificent story, but one that actually addresses and deals with these really important issues. Can you just talk a bit about that, please?
Yeah. So I started the novel because after reading Simon Winchester's book, The Surgeon of Crowthorne, I was interested in this idea of, well, does this mean that some words have been lost because they weren't written down by the right people? I did a bit of research just for my own curiosity, and I couldn't find, I was unsatisfied with what I found. I couldn't actually find answers to my questions. And so what I thought I would do is I would put a girl into the Scriptorium where all the words for the English language are being defined, and I would follow her throughout her life to see how she affects the words and how the words affect her. And for me, this was the only way I could answer the question, because history doesn't help me. There is no answer to this question that I could find. And so I used fiction to explore it. And so while I had an idea of where the story was going, I was constantly in a conversation, I suppose, with the Oxford English Dictionary, the first edition, with the words at that time. I had the opportunity twice to go to Oxford to do research and to, delve into the archives and hold those slips of paper, the original slips, and undo the original string. I mean, it was incredible. I'm getting, every time I think of it, I just can't believe I was allowed to do it. I didn't have to wear white gloves or anything. I got to see and handle and scrutinize the proof pages of the dictionary. So I saw when a line had been put through a word, and I saw what other words were on the page that had not been excised from the dictionary. And these are the things that populated the story for me. These are the things that would get me excited. And then I'd think, how would Esme react to this? What would it mean for a young woman at the turn of the 20th century, at a time when women were fighting for the right to vote? They were fighting for their words to be heard and to be meaningful. Again, a bit of deja vu, isn't it? Yeah. And so I just thought, the parallels actually were fascinating. And I didn't realize that until I started writing, because I was initially just interested in the Oxford English Dictionary. But as soon as I put it into the historical context, I was fascinated by the parallel development, I suppose, of the women's suffrage movement in the UK and the Oxford English Dictionary, because interestingly, they both culminated within weeks of each other. So the dictionary was published in April 1928, the end of April 1928, and women got full suffrage just weeks later. And this was just, so interesting to me. And I felt like Esme was there were so many forces playing on Esme. There was the dictionary and the words, there was the suffrage movement, and eventually the war. But and these things are not inseparable. The words that went into the dictionary can't be separated in a way from the social upheaval that was happening at the time. And Esme, I suppose, is the link between those things.
And that's actually true. And you also do this other really clever thing in that when you look at the women in the novel, because the novel's not just about the dictionary and about words, it's about, as you said, it's about the suffragette movement, the suffragist movement, the Great War plays a role, but it's also about other kinds of women. So you've got, for instance, Lizzie, the maid, the housemaid who serves Esme and who is, you know, down the social strata. Then you've got Mabel in the covered market, you know, who was a prostitute, Tilda, and then you've got Edith and Beth Thompson, who are so important to the story as well. And it seems to me that in a way you've sort of done a wonderful representation of different kinds of women, all bringing their words and their lives to the story. So it's this really beautifully woven together tapestry of words and lives. So, I mean, you know, congratulations on that. And in fact, halfway through the book, Esme asks Lizzie, do you think there are some words that only women use or that apply to women specifically? And I think it's just a brilliant question because it still resonates today. I mean, it's still true today. And I really found Lizzie a wonderful, she's a fully realized character in her own right, but she's also a wonderful vehicle for further exploration of these themes and ideas that you're obviously, you know, addressing and dealing with. So can you tell us a little bit more about Lizzie, who's so brilliantly realized, but she has a need, and she expresses it in the book, she has a need to exist.
Yes.
Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked about Lizzie. Lizzie, I think, is my favorite character. And for me, when I think about it, I think of Esme as she is the story between the lines of the Oxford English Dictionary. When I think of Lizzie, her story lives between the lines of this book, because while she is in the book through from beginning to end, it's not her voice that we're hearing. It's a middle-class woman's voice that we're hearing in Esme. Yeah. Lizzie is Esme's confidant, Esme's friend, Esme's carer, but it's not Lizzie's story. And for me, I hoped that when readers read this, they would be filling in some of the gaps in this book from Lizzie's point of view, because she has been silenced essentially in that world. The suffrage movement is a good example actually of how working class women were second class citizens within the suffrage, especially the suffragette movement, because Emmeline Pankhurst was willing to sacrifice votes for working class women in order to get them for middle class women. And in fact, that's what happened in 1918. The women who got the vote in 1918 were women with property or a university degree, which was a difficult thing for women to get in 1918. But the women, and they had to be 30. So younger women and women from working classes who would never in their lifetime own property were denied the vote in 1918. In 1928, they finally got it. But it was important to me to have Lizzie in the story. It was important to me to have, I suppose, what you described as a layered story of women's experience and women's words. Because we do live different lives depending on the privileges that we've inherited or gained. And I think it's important to recognize that when we're discussing it, thinking about it, writing about it. So that's why Lizzie's in there, and other women's perspectives as well. The other thing I wanted to do with the women, and actually the way you say it makes it sound like it was meticulously planned. It wasn't. what happened was, like I said, I put Esme on the page, and then I wrote her into adulthood, and these characters kind of, Lizzie was always there, but other characters kind of come and go as they needed to, and or they come into my mind as they needed to come into Esme's life. And what I realized was I was also writing a story about how a young woman who doesn't have a mother, so Esme is motherless, how she navigates the world through the relationships that she develops with other women. And so all of the women in the story have an impact on Esme, just like the words have an impact on her. And someone said the other day, and I had never thought of it this way, but it was so beautiful, because the book is all about how words can mean different things. And the word love comes up in the book. And someone said to me that the book is actually an illustration of the very many variants of love, because there's, all of the women in Esme's life love her in a different kind of way, as do the men. And I thought that was a lovely insight into the book that I didn't have personally myself, but I'm glad it worked out that way.
I think it's very true, and that was one of the things I felt the different women did represent different aspects of Esme's own experience too, and it's really well done. So do you think women will always have to work to take their rightful place in the world? Because your novel shows how much and how often they come after men, how men's words have defined women and women's experiences, and how for so long women have been forced to fill the gaps or even make the openings in what has largely been men's history, so that their story can also be told.
I
do. You think that we're getting there?
I think these things they change in increments, and I think they're generational. I've been thinking about this a lot recently, as you can imagine. So we're still talking about the value of women's words today. You know, when we talk about he said, she said, we're talking about, are his words more valuable than her words? You know, so that's the language we're using sometimes at the moment when we're talking about sexual assault. Whose words are more valuable? And climate change is another area where I started thinking about this. So before we had COVID, we had bushfires and we had climate crisis. And we had a whole lot of male politicians and shock jocks describing young female climate activists as hysterical, mentally ill, and suggesting that their parents weren't controlling them or caring for them properly. And I'm talking about Greta Thunberg in particular here, but similar things have been said about other young women. They are exactly the same, sometimes exactly the same words, but the same phrases that were used to describe the suffragettes. And essentially, and this, I can talk about the word suffragette as well, which has a fascinating sort of history. But I think that for a while, I think we thought we'd come such a long way. And now I'm starting to think we have far further to go than we ever thought. It took hundreds of years for universal suffrage without women, for men to have equal rights. It took a few more hundred years for women to get the right to vote, have political equivalence. We still don't have political equivalence in that we still don't have equal numbers of men and women in Parliament. Representing us, making laws and so on. We still don't have equivalence in so many areas of public discourse. And I don't think we probably will in my lifetime, unfortunately, because I do think these things, I think change is generational. I think my children and my children's children will use different language around women, but I'm not sure it's something that I will live to see. And I don't think I'm a pessimist. I think I'm a realist. I think it will change, definitely. But I think it has been slow, and I think it will continue to be slow.
So your book continues to be hugely successful. Do you think this is in part due to readers' discovery that the women are missing, that our words are missing from so many important places, not just the dictionary, but
I think so. Some people have said, it's kind of come at the right time. I think the other thing is, though, that I had this idea, and it was one of those issues, or it was one of those concerns or problems, whatever you want to call it, that was sitting in plain sight. We all have a dictionary on our shelves, and yet it sort of took this little moment of insight, this little connection between one book I was reading and this thought, to realize that dictionary on my shelf isn't the objective text that I thought it was. And it's obvious, like you said, it's so obvious once we say it out loud, but I couldn't believe that nobody had really written about it in fiction. I have to say, there are some feminist dictionary scholars who have written about some of this sort of thing, but who reads dictionary scholars? Not many people. And so from a sort of, I suppose, general knowledge point of view, from a fiction point of view, it hasn't been written about. And I got so excited when I realized I'd had this sort of original idea, because that never happens. And then terrified that, in fact, it wasn't original and surely someone's written about it. And then my greatest fear was that it was an important idea and I might not be able to meet it. I might let it down. I had that, if I hesitated to write this book, that was why, because I didn't want to let the idea down. I didn't want to write something that didn't match the importance.
The enormity and importance of the idea. And the fact that you actually did achieve it, because, I mean, everybody I've said, I'm talking to Pip Williams, and said, I love that book, and I think so many readers, men and women, have really got so much out of it. And it makes you, it gives you pause, it makes you think, which is, I think, emblematic of the best books, surely,
Thank you.
Now, look, we do have some questions. So Vicky has asked, how have you managed your dyslexia so well, leading to you having a number of successful careers and everything that they entail? Do you want to tell?
Thank you, Vicky. Yes, I have dyslexia, and as a child, that was a problem, in that I was constantly held back at lunchtime to write words out 10 times until I got it right, which never worked because I couldn't recognize that I was writing a word wrong. So I would write it 3 different ways in one list. But the dyslexia is an interesting thing, because dyslexia is a problem with writing and reproducing symbols, reproducing words in the correct spelling, the correct form, making them look right. But it's not a problem of composition. So one thing that I never had trouble with was thinking the words, if that makes sense. And unfortunately, for me, the way I expressed myself was through the composition of words. I loved putting them together, even though on the page they looked a mess and other people might not have been able to read them. But I still had the ideas. Being dyslexic doesn't stop you having ideas or expressing yourself, but it does make it difficult for people to understand what you've written. I was lucky in that my parents and teachers encouraged me for the most part. And as soon as technologies arrived, my dad would sort of try to give me a technology that would help. So I came before PCs, but I had a computer at university, not a computer, a typewriter at university that would type out a single line of text before printing it, and it would underline all the words that were incorrect, and so that I could go back and try and correct them before it printed it on the page. So that's where I started. And I guess I was just, I was I was just determined. I had no other way of expressing myself, Vicky. So I don't know what I would have done if I didn't write. And initially I wasn't writing for anyone else. I was just writing for myself. So I wasn't being judged. And by the time I was judged, I suppose I didn't start writing fiction for a very long time, but I have always had jobs, as you suggest, where writing was important. So I was an academic for a very long time and writing was important. There's always somebody to correct, you know, to correct bad spelling. Probably the biggest problem I've ever felt from the dyslexia wasn't so much the writing, it's the reading. I can read, obviously, but I'm very slow. And in my dreams, I'm a speed reader because there's so much to read. There's so much to research. I would love to be able to read faster, but I can't.
We have another question, but I wanted to, before I ask it, just go back to one of the things that really prompted you to write this book, and that is that the Oxford University Press only ever admitted to having lost one word out of the dictionary. Obviously, I think a great many more were missing from the dictionary, but this is the only one they ever admitted to actually losing. Do you want to tell us what the word was and tell us about it? And then I've got a question about that.
Yeah, actually, we've missed talking about this. This is often right at the beginning of a talk because the word bondmaid went missing accidentally from the Oxford English Dictionary. And according to James Murray, it is the only word that was ever lost accidentally, which I do find a little unbelievable. But the thing about this word is they didn't find out for 13 years that it was missing. And it was a member of the public wrote a letter to James Murray asking why it wasn't in the dictionary. And apparently he really lost his temper when he found out it wasn't in the dictionary. And there was quite a lot of correspondence, which I've seen, about this word and the fact that no other words could be lost and you know, he didn't know how it had happened and so on. And because they don't know how it happened, that was kind of a little bit of gold for me because I could make that up. And that's where Esme comes in. She steals the word bondmaid. But the other bit of serendipity for me was the word itself. Bondmaid. Yeah, bondmaid means slave girl. And if there is a bondmaid in this story, for me, it's Lizzie. But, you know, there are lots of bondmaids in this story, depending on how you define it. And for me, and there are other words in the book as well, some of the words have their own kind of storyline, if you like. They're characters in the book, just like the Scriptorium for me is a character in the book. You know, they have a beginning, a middle and an end in many cases. And I was really interested to have words in the book that changed because that's what the English language does, and that had personalities in a way, and that were affected by the world around them and the people around them. And I was interested to explore that in the way that often fiction writers will with a character, a human character, but I was also interested to have that for some of the words in the book.
Well, you certainly achieved it. So Ruth says, regarding Lizzie, how did you discover the word bondmaid? I found that a profound word that I had never known, and I was quite shocked by that. It produced a deep response in me, although I knew that working class women were excluded from society. So that I found the word because it kept coming up as an anecdote in the history, but no one could ever explain it. And then I looked it up in the dictionary, and in fact I have an original, a first edition volume of A and B, and I love constantly checking to make sure that the word bondmaid isn't there, and it's not there, but it is in the second edition, which was published in 1989. And it's very simply, it's one of those words that doesn't have many variants. It just has one meaning in the first edition, and that meaning is slave girl. And then there's quite a few sentences, not in the first edition, in the second edition, when you look it up, the meaning is slave girl, and it's got quite a number of sentences that show you how that word has been used in text.
And it doesn't always mean a slave as in a Roman slave, the kind of slave that we might think of from history. It often does mean a bonded servant, like Lizzie. And especially prior to World War I, that was a very common way for working class people to live their entire lives, was as a bonded servant to a family. And they'd sometimes, like Lizzie, come in when they were very young, still children, and stay with that family until the day they die, much like, any bonded slave. So even though they might get paid, their circumstances didn't allow them to ever really have any other choices until the war came along. And then there were many other choices for many servants, actually, because servants were paid far less than factory workers.
Yeah, absolutely. Always a silver lining, even in the most appalling circumstances.
That's right, yeah.
So Daleen asks, because Lizzie herself, once she understood when Esme tells her the word bondmaid, Lizzie describes herself as a bondmaid.
Yes.
And Daleen asks, was there a Lizzie in your life? Is there a Lizzie?
A Lizzie in my life? Well, I haven't had, no, there isn't a Lizzie.
Was there a Lizzie in the story?
No,
in the history of that?
Do you know what? I would say yes, of course. All these middle class and upper class families had servants prior to World War I, especially. That's just a given, that you would have a servant. James Murray was, when he came to the project, he was sort of lower middle class is how we would describe him now. He certainly rose in the class ranks because of his work on the dictionary. He lived in a house in Oxford with his wife Ada and 11 healthy children. There's no way that they wouldn't have had a servant or two helping with the household. And that was very normal. I can't imagine there'd be many middle class people with 11 children who wouldn't today have someone helping in the household. So so Lizzie's existed, but this particular Lizzie is fiction.
Vicky, who asked the question about your dyslexia, has just said, thank you for that fabulous answer, Pip, which gives many people great hope, I'm sure, and I'll be telling my students about your perseverance.
Oh, wonderful. Can I add to that, Vicky? I think sometimes when something challenges you, it actually becomes of great interest to you, because a lot of people are kind of bemused that I chose to write a book about dictionaries, which I actually hated as a child, because people were always telling me to look words up in the dictionary. But if you can't spell, a dictionary is quite a challenge. And yet it's what I was drawn to. And I think that might be the same for all sorts of things. When you have something that challenges you in your life, you tend to be drawn to it out of interest. And rather than shying away from it, I embraced the challenge.
Well, I think that actually leads very nicely into a question from Erica, who asks, do you have memories of having to rely on the meaning of a word from the dictionary? I sometimes had my own meanings of words, she says. Which I think
yes, I didn't rely on dictionary definitions very often because I avoided the dictionary as a child. But I also, and this is a dyslexic characteristic, apparently. My son is also dyslexic, so I've learned more about dyslexia from his, from going to the psychologist with him. And apparently this is also a dyslexic characteristic, is muddling words up in speech, which is something I did quite frequently. So words that have similar sounds, I would just confuse. And so it's definitely this, I've never done this, but it's that Kath and Kim thing where I would say, I want to be effluent. And I've had many instances of doing that. So, I was sort of changing the meanings of words accidentally, but not on purpose.
Mrs. Malaprop would be proud of you. So I don't think it's anything to worry about. So tell us about the dictionary now. where is the OED up to now? Does it now include so many of the words that were missing from the lexicon? Are women better represented? Have they found a solution? I'm most interested in this, to the problem of the unwritten words. Or are we finding more words are now written?
Yeah, excellent question. And I do like this kind of a question because I am still hugely impressed by that first edition of the Oxford English Dictionary. Given the times and the constraints and the fact that, you know, so many people were illiterate and so on, James Murray did an extraordinary thing. However, the second edition, which was published in 1989, added, you know, thousands more words and meanings and also examples of use. And one of those is the word suffragette, which has a lovely history, and I'm happy to talk about it if there's time. But in the first edition, it's in the first edition of the Oxford English Dictionary, even though it was only coined in 1906. So it didn't exist before 1906. But all of the sentences that are used to explain the word are sentences used by men. So none of the sentences used to describe suffragette were sentences written by women. But in 1989, they did add some new sentences. And in fact, one is from Germaine Greer. So a couple of new sentences from women who were actually feminists and at the time might have been suffragettes if they'd lived earlier. What they're doing now, and so the first edition of the Oxford English Dictionary is about 12 volumes, and each volume, and you can't see it because the screen's not big enough, but they're about this thick and, you know, huge, huge books. The second edition was 20 volumes. The third edition is currently being written, but it's unlikely that it will ever be published in hard copy because it will be so enormous. And one of the reasons it will be so enormous is because just like back in the 1850s, the goal of the Oxford English Dictionary is to document every word in the English language, past and present. But now there are many, many, many more words, and there are many more texts to turn to get the definitions of words. So a number of things that are happening with the Oxford English Dictionary now is that lexicographers have many more sources for words than they did back at the turn of the 20th century. They have texts and social media and email and all of these other ways that we write words down because they can be archived. So they are part of the lexicographers' toolbox these days. And of course, literacy is much higher across the English-speaking world, and literacy is equal between men and women across the English-speaking world, more or less. Men probably still have, I don't know about this, I'm not quite sure. I'm not an expert on whether more books are written by men or women. Certainly different types of books are written by men and women, but there's many more sources of words from women. Yeah. And we also have had a greater interest, I suppose, in different types of lives. And so, and also there's slang dictionaries. There's so much interest in different types of language. And so I think the Oxford English Dictionary these days, and like I said earlier, they're cleaning up the sexist and racist language that's inherent in the first and second edition. So it's a work in progress, essentially, and that's one of the beautiful things about the English language as well. And the Oxford English Dictionary is starting to reflect that, yeah.
So that original idea of Jonathan Swift's that it should be fixed, that language should be fixed, is long gone.
Long gone. And I don't think you'd find a lexicographer, an English lexicographer, who would abide by that idea. I think it's the evolution of words that makes the English language such a beautiful thing. And if you think that, then you have to be interested in the words that people from all walks of life and all backgrounds speak, and how they change words to mean exactly what they need them to mean. And this is, I suppose, what my book is all about. For Esme, she turned to the words all the time to try and find a way to express herself and understand her experience. And so often the words let her down.
Yes,
and
yes.
I think that is that's an experience for many people who say come to Australia, so immigrants, refugees, but even people who have been on this land far longer than us, who have lost their own language. And yeah.
Which brings me to one of the points I really did want to talk to you about in your epilogue. And I'm hoping that those who have not read the book will actually rush out and buy it and borrow it from the library and read it, because it's really worth it. But your epilogue set in Adelaide in 1989, and it points to that exact flaw, the assumption that if a language is not written, then it doesn't exist or has no value. And that has been true for our Indigenous Australians. I think that, you know, so much of the Indigenous language of this physical land has been lost because when, Europeans came here, they saw no value in a language that was different from their own.
That's right.
They believed, and I mean, it was very much too, particularly in the Victorian era, that, you know, God was perceived to be an Englishman, and that it was God's great work to spread English as a language around the world through the dominions. I mean, even the word dominion is problematic, I think, you know. So of course, that is something that's hopefully now we're beginning to we're trying to rescue a lot of those Indigenous languages.
Yeah, and this is a good time for me to acknowledge that the book was written on Paramank country and also Kaurna country. So Paramank people of the Adelaide Hills and Kaurna people of the Adelaide Plains. And one of the things I was interested in, I think historical fiction is an incredible way to understand ourselves and our history, but also our present and the possibilities for our future. And so by the time I wrote this book, I was, by the end of it, I was interested in how it resonated with today, and with the experience that I've had of living and speaking the English language. And of course, all I could think about really is Indigenous languages, and how Aboriginal culture is an oral culture. They didn't write down words. They spoke them. They passed on their history through story. In Adelaide, and I can't speak to other parts of Australia, but when Adelaide was settled by Europeans, German missionaries came over and they sat with some of the Kaurna elders of the Adelaide Plains, and they wrote down their words. They didn't get them all right. They didn't write them all down, but they kept a partial record of Kaurna language. And if they hadn't done that, we would have a far sketchier record of some of the Kaurna language, because in fact, like you said, what happened was, you know, there's this eradication of Indigenous languages, this insistence that Aboriginal people speak English, and many generations lost the ability to speak their cultural tongue. And when we do that to a people, what we take away from them isn't just the ability to speak in their mother tongue. We take away from them a way of understanding who they are, understanding the environment that they and their ancestors have grown up in. But we also deprive ourselves, as in the settlers, they are deprived of this deep understanding of this place that they now want to call home. And we lose so much as a people. And Kaurna language is now being revived. And since the 80s and 90s, there's been a huge effort to revive the Kaurna language. And, you know, a lot has been lost, but a lot is being found. And that was something that I thought was, you know, an important part of, I suppose, this story, because again, it resonates. These things come in cycles. They just affect different people.
We have to finish. I'm very sad. to say we have to wind up. Fortunately, we've run out of time.
It's just been
much as I would love to keep talking.
Yeah. I'd just like to say thank you to everybody.
I just want to thank everyone for a great.
I think we might have lost Jen, but I will thank everybody. If you can't hear Jen, it's just been the most incredible opportunity to actually connect with you people in Geelong. And coming from Adelaide, I also just want to say I really appreciate the year that you had last year. Very, very difficult. And thank you for welcoming me to Geelong. It's been a pleasure.
Oh, it's been wonderful to have you, Pip. Thank you, everyone, for a great discussion. Thank you, everyone, for joining in. And remember, published by a firm press, the wonderful Dictionary of Lost Words is available to purchase through the website and of any of Geelong's or Melbourne's, if you've come from further afield, any fabulous bookstore in Australia and America tomorrow and the UK.
If you're traveling.
And hard copies, of course, are also available to borrow from the Geelong Library. So wonderful, wonderful novel, highly recommended. Fabulous, fabulous Pip Williams. Thank you so much. And on behalf of Geelong Regional Libraries, thank you all for joining us tonight, and good night.
Thank you. Bye-bye.